So in this video, we're going to take a look at a time lapse of this last part of the project being put together that I created. You're taking your first two projects and piecing them back together to just, again, take things a step further and create one project that's focused on having a foreground, middle ground, and background. And then you're still using all of the compositional rules and the elements of art and principles of design that we focused on with these two. So the main thing is having a clear focal point along with that foreground, middle ground, and background on top of those compositional rules. So getting started with putting these together, I'm just deciding on a consistent kind of design to begin with that's going to focus on unity. So I want everything to be unified and have that unity that ties everything together. So I'm going to be working a lot with triangles. But maybe pick a few different shapes that you could either cut out or that you could use with your first two projects to piece them back together. They could be detailed shapes. You could be keeping both of them how they are and putting them side by side, or maybe one you use as your background and you cut out a circle in the middle of your second one and just put it right on top of the other. So be creative with how you're combining them. But for this, I'm just combining and cutting out different shapes to create my image. On the background, I made sure that I had something that was going to be desaturated, so nothing is super bright for my background, which is that black and purple. And then I knew that I had purple mainly on my one piece that I was going to cut up and use, so I wanted to put a little bit of purple into my background as well, but kept it pretty muted so it's not super obvious. But to unify it, I threw in some of that purple for repetition. And then I'm also doing repetition of shape and form here, so I'm keeping these shapes as triangles. I'm repeating and moving that color around, and I'm just trying to create movement through the placement of these. So I'm making sure that they're all angled so that you can kind of jump from one to the next as you're looking at this image. So remember to use those different compositional rules that we talked about in this piece. I'm also using framing, so the way that I have the vignette where it's darker on the outside and then fades in towards the middle, and that's going to help to frame my focal point that I'm going to be adding in a minute. But again, I'm just really focused on this placement here, making sure that the eye is going to move throughout the piece. I'm varying the size of my triangles, and then I'm throwing in some pieces that have cardboard to just emphasize that movement. And then I'm taking my other piece, and that's going to mainly be my focal point. So I'm thinking about how can I make this focal point stand out as my foreground. So what I'm doing here is going over the blue triangles, which are going to be my middle ground. So they're in front of my background, but behind my foreground. And that just helped them to fade a little bit. So there still is some contrast, but there's not going to be as much contrast on my middle ground as there is on the foreground. So on this focal point, I'm going to make sure that there's really dark areas and really light areas, which is why I decided to flip those triangles upside down to use the white paper that was underneath, and then just use some smaller triangles of what I had created to put on top of it so that there is that contrast and helps it to really stand out. So that background's really faded there. And I'm thinking about the placement of my focal point. I'm still making sure that I have lead space. So I want to make sure those triangles are pointing off into the direction that is not cut off. And here I'm just going in with charcoal to emphasize my focal point. I felt like it still did not stand out enough against that background. So I'm increasing the contrast. There's a lot of white areas, but now I need to create those dark areas to help it to jump and stand out more. And same thing, I'm going in with yellow here because I felt like it still did not stand out enough and needed more contrast to draw the attention of the focal point. And then I'm not only putting that yellow on the focal point, but I'm throwing it into just a few of the shapes in the background to create that variety and make everything cohesive and unified. And then the way that I'm using texture here is a lot of different textures in the way that I applied the charcoal in the background, and then there's that clear texture that was already applied from my previous project. But make sure that you're hitting all of those different compositional rules and that you're hitting all of the elements that we talked about, along with having a clear foreground, middle ground, and background created.